Enlightenment. Chapter 5. 8 Contemporary Enlightenment Experiences of Japanese and Westerners. Editor's Introduction. In recent years, stories of the enlightenments of ancient Chinese Zen monks have found their way into English. While their laudable aim is to inspire and instruct modern readers, paradoxically they often have the opposite effect. Contemporary Asians or Westerners surveying the paths to self-realization that these ancient worthies trod are all too likely to say to themselves, "It's all very well for these people. They could attain Satori because they were monks isolated from the hurly-burly of the world, celibates unburdened by the affections and responsibilities of family life. In their day life was relatively simple. Theirs was not a highly organized industrial society making insatiable demands on the individual. The spirit of the day and mine is vastly different. What meaning can their enlightenment have for me?" Quote. No such objections can be raised to the following 8 accounts. These Asians and Westerners are living among us today, neither as monks nor unworldly solitaries but as business and professional men and women, artists, and housewives. All have trained in Zen under a modern master and realized their self-nature to one degree or another. Their stories bear witness that what one person has done others can do, that Satori is no impossible ideal. The majority of these Enlightenment stories first appeared in Japanese Buddhist publications, from which they were translated into English, the remainder having been solicited specifically for this book. They have been pruned in such a way as to eliminate irrelevant background material without sacrificing either the thread of events which was significant in propelling these people into their awakening, or their varied and intimate reactions to zazen and the elements of Zen training. By not rigidly limiting these accounts to the circumstances of the Enlightenment itself, we believe we have added to their value as human documents. Each of these stories bears in its caption the age and occupation of the individual at the time of her or his enlightenment. All were written soon after the experience with the exception of number 3, which was not set to paper until almost 20 years later. Account number 2 is the editor's own experience and number 8 that of his wife. More often than not, the ordinary mystical experience of expanded consciousness comes purely by chance. And since it is unconnected with a proven discipline, a discipline for sustaining and enlarging it, it affects little or no transformation of personality or character, eventually fading into a happy memory. Kensho is no such haphazard phenomenon. Like a sprout which emerges from a soil which has been seeded, fertilized, and thoroughly weeded, Satori comes to a mind that has heard and believed the Buddha truth and then uprooted within itself the crippling delusion of self and other. And just as one must nurture a newly emerged seedling until maturity, so Zen training stresses the need to ripen an initial awakening through subsequent koan practice and/or shikantaza until it thoroughly animates one's life. In other words, to function on the higher level of consciousness brought about by Kensho, one must further train oneself to act in accordance with this perception of truth. This special relationship between awakening and post-awakening zazen is brought out in a parable in one of the sutras. In this story, enlightenment is compared to a youth who, after years of destitute wandering in a distant land, one day discovers that his wealthy father had many years earlier bequeathed him his fortune. To actually take possession of this treasure, which is rightly his, and become capable of handling it wisely is equated with post-Kensho zazen, that is, with broadening and deepening the initial awakening. The perceptive reader will observe that these enlightenments vary in their clarity and depth. That some individuals, in Zen parlance, have actually taken hold of the ox, while others have barely seen its tracks, although examples can be found of profound enlightenment having been attained after only a few years' exertion and of shallow Kensho having resulted from a lengthy effort at zazen. In the majority of cases, the more extensive the zazen prior to awakening, the more wholehearted and pure, the broader and firmer the enlightenment which follows. What manner of people were these who, like the carp in the Chinese fable that leapt up the waterfall in a mighty thrust to become a dragon, could rise to a higher level of consciousness, to a wholly new awareness of the indivisibility of all life and the basic emptiness of all things? Certainly none was gifted with extraordinary intellect, nor were any endowed with supranormal powers. Suffering they had each known, but it was no more than what is experienced in the lifetime of an ordinary person. If they were exceptional in any way, it was simply in their courage to go they knew not where by a road they knew not of, prompted by a faith in their real self. Seekers who fail to find are still entrapped by their illusion of two worlds. One of perfection that lies beyond, of peace without struggle, of unending joy. The other the everyday meaningless world of pain and evil which is scarcely worth relating oneself to. Secretly they long for the former even as they openly despise the latter. Yet such people hesitate to plunge into the teeming void, into the abyss of their own primal nature, because in the deepest unconscious they fear abandoning their familiar world of duality for the unknown world of oneness, the reality of which they still doubt. The finders, on the other hand, are retrained by neither fears nor doubts. Casting both aside, they leap because they can't do otherwise. They simply must and no longer know why. And so they triumph. The bulk of these enlightenments came in Sesshin, a vehicle of spiritual discipline whose exact counterpart can be found nowhere in Buddhism except Zen. Sesshin in one form or another goes back to the time of the Buddha, when monks would train themselves in seclusion during the several months of the rainy season. The purpose of Sesshin, as the word implies, is to enable one to collect and unify one's normally scattered mind in order to focus it like a powerful telescope inward in order to discover one's true self-nature. During Sesshin, the basic teaching devices and methods of Zen, that is, zazen, teisho, and dokusan, are coordinated into a meaningful whole during 7 days of seclusion. Kensho is not of course confined to Sesshin. But since Sesshin is unquestionably its most potent incubator, the progressive steps involved in this unique form of mind maturation are worth describing at some length if the reader is to have a clear insight into this incubation process. In a monastery, Sesshin actually begins with certain ceremonies the evening before formal zazen begins. In the dimly lit zendo, which is to be the hub of all activities for 1 week, solemn head monks assemble the participants for the purpose of assigning places, instructing newcomers how to enter and leave the zendo unobtrusively, how to handle their utensils and bowls silently during meals, how to walk in kinhan, and how to get on and off their sitting cushions quietly. With the conclusion of these formalities, everyone is summoned to the main hall, ablaze with lights, by the ponderous beats of the giant monastery drum. Dressed in formal sitting attire, the participants line up in 2 rows facing each other across the hall. Kneel in the traditional Japanese posture, then bow to each other as a sign of mutual respect and identification with one another's aspiration. There is an air of suppressed excitement and hushed expectancy when, a few minutes later, the Roshi and his principal aides in full ceremonial dress enter. As they pass between the 2 ranks to take their seats at the head of the hall, all bow again, this time with heads touching the tatami mats, out of deep respect for their teachers. After welcoming everyone, the Roshi speaks in effect as follows. During Sesshin you are not to talk with one another, as speaking disrupts the concentrated mind and thus hinders your own practice and that of others. Each must devote himself single-mindedly to his own zazen to the exclusion of everything else, including a concern with his neighbor's problems. If you have pressing questions, speak to the head monks out of earshot of the others. Your eyes should always rest unfocused in front of you while sitting, standing, walking, or working. At a distance of about 1 yard when sitting and about 2 yards in the other positions. When your eyes dart about and fix themselves on something or other, this contact creates an impression, which in turn gives rise to a thought. Thoughts multiply and then like flies buzz about in the mind, making concentration difficult if not impossible. Do not therefore divert your eyes for any reason whatever. During session dispense with social amenities of every sort. Don't greet one another, good morning, or bid one another, good night, and don't compliment or criticize each other. Further, you mustn't make a point of stepping aside to allow others to go ahead, nor should you push ahead of them. In all your activities you should move neither hastily nor sluggishly but naturally, like flowing water. It is advisable in session to eat no more than half of what you normally eat, and if you follow this caution your zazen will be more effective. However, zazen is not asceticism and it is unwise to abstain altogether from food, as your mind might become disturbed by pangs of hunger or you might find yourself becoming too weak to do zazen. If you have no desire to eat during certain meals because you are striving particularly hard, you may of course refuse food. Do not eat too rapidly or so slowly that everyone has to wait for you. Ideally all should finish at approximately the same time so as not to upset the established rhythm of the session. Be careful not to rattle your bowls when you uncover them and when you put them away, and munch the pickled radishes as quietly as possible. Such sounds often prove intrusive to beginners. For some reason, many people imagine it is more difficult for women to come to self-realization than for men. On the contrary, women usually attain Kensho quicker because their minds are less prone to play with ideas than are men's. But both men and women, if they expunge every thought from their minds and become selfless, can equally attain enlightenment during 1 week of session. Many have done so in the past and a few determined ones will do it during this session. Lastly, bear in mind that session is a cooperative endeavor in which there is mutual support and stimulation only if all participate jointly in session activities and do not follow their own inclinations. To indulge your own desires at the expense of this common effort is an expression of ego and hence inimical to our purpose, both individual and collective. The Roshi then concludes by exhorting all to do their utmost. Tea and cakes are now served, first to the Roshi, next to the head monks, and then to those assembled. The Roshi sips his tea first and is followed by the others. Again he is the first to eat his cake, after which everyone joins him. This ritual is not without significance. It symbolizes the joining of all hearts and minds in this common undertaking. At the same time it is an expression of the students' confidence in their teacher, by whom they agree to be led, and of their faith in the Dharma which he expounds. This ceremony over, the Roshi and his aides depart, and once more all bow to them as before. The 9 o'clock bell tolls and everyone retires to bed. In 6 hours the great venture begins. Clang, clang. 3 a.m. Sessions begun. Slightly dazed newcomers rub sleepy eyes. Fumble with quilts, seasoned hands alertly fold and store bedding. Go to the toilet. Brush teeth. Dash cold water on their faces. Dress. Mount the tan in a quick movement. Adjust their sitting cushions. Begin zazen no time. No effort wasted. Lethargic beginners clumsily climb onto the tan and their cushions, adjusting, wriggling, readjusting. Minutes later the Roshi silently enters, walking in the rear. He inspects backs, to his comprehending eye more eloquently revealing the mind's tension or slackness than the face. A sagging spine arches with a light crack of his stick. Another straightens merely with whispered advice or encouragement. Each sitter as Roshi passes by greets him with gasho, the universal gesture of humility, respect, and gratitude. Roshi may relate to the now wall-gazing sitters an inspiring anecdote of an ancient Zen worthy or a noteworthy contemporary. After all, he concludes, he was only human. If he could awaken, so can you. Jaws grimly set. The struggle is on. Clang. Clang. Kinhan 45 minutes have elapsed. Old-timers flip off their cushions in one swirl. Cat land on their feet, fall in line and slowly circle the zendo, hands folded across chest, with measured steps, concentrated mind. Clang. Kinhan finishes. Some quickly mount the tan, others head for the toilet. Clang. 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 The next sitting period commences. The